Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Danail, and today what we're going to be talking about is composable components using React context. To give you some context about myself, I'm currently working at a company called Material UI. Maybe some of you have heard of it, maybe some of you have not. But what it is one of the largest frameworks out there for reusable React components. So yeah, let's get cracking. Let's see what we're going to talk about. But before that, let's just have a little bit of introduction about Material and what the hell it is. So as I said, it's one of the biggest open source libraries out there for reusable React components. We have about 65,000 starts on GitHub, about 300,000 downloads per day, which results in about 6 million downloads per month. So we know a thing or two about UI components written in React. And a promotion, let's get into the actual content. So what are we going to be talking today? Let's go through the bullet points. So first things first, we'll check what the current state of how to create reusable UI components with React is. We'll check what problems you may have with the current approach. We'll have a brief overview of what React context actually is. Then we'll define the requirements of what we want to achieve in this talk. We'll have some live code examples. Hopefully they work. We'll have some demo, of course, and some closing words. Cool. So let's get cracking. First things first, the current state of UI components in React. By having properties that people can use to modify your custom components. So let's look at a common example, which is like a button component. So what we have here is I have a simple app function, app component. I'm invoking my custom button. My custom button accepts a single property, which is color, and passing red. Then in the button, I'm grabbing that prop, and I'm setting an arbitrary class using that prop. Basically, I'm creating a class name with a suffix of the provided color prop. Now that pretty much is the basics, but there's one important thing here that happens. And as you can see, we are passing, it's a single direction and only a single level where we're passing props. So basically we have a relationship that our app passes to our button with a single level directly the prop. Now this is, again, the most basic example. So let's look at something a little bit more interesting with another example and spice it up a bit. So again, here I have a pretty similar structure. You can see the code on the left. So let's examine it. So first things first, in our app component, now we no longer have some static variable that we want to pass around, but rather we have something more interesting, which is like a theme. So a theme is a good example because it essentially is something that most of the web applications out there need. So let's take that. So let's say I'm setting the theme. It's a simple object. It has color primary red. Again, now I no longer have the button directly invoked in the app. What I have is another component, which is main component. So I need to pass the theme to that main component. In the main component, I have another component again, not the button, called topnav. Now the topnav also needs to receive the theme. And finally, we get to the topnav. As you can see, the topnav is the one that invokes our custom component, the button, and it's actually the one that really cares about the theme. So here you can see I'm grabbing the theme from props, passing the name of the color to my button, and the button is whatever was in the first example. It's just a button, grab the color from the props, set the arbitrary class name. Now, as you can see, this is quite tricky because we need to pass a property around between multiple levels of components. And what this is called is actually the technical term is called property drilling. And you can imagine it's quite bad. So the kind of definition of it is that property drilling is also called threading, refers to the process where you have to go throughout to get data to parts of your React component tree. Now, this is bad because of a couple of reasons. First things first, it creates, if you do this multiple times, it creates a very hard to maintain code base because most of your components will be entangled together, meaning they will depend on each other, and they'll need to have a specific place in the chain of components. So if you go back to the previous example, with the example of the main and the top nav, for instance, now the main needs to know to receive a theme and then needs to know to pass it down to the top nav, which kind of makes the theme very hard, the main component very hard to actually remove from this chain or use it somewhere else. So cool. So having this cleared out, some workarounds, kinda, maybe. So one potential workaround, and probably some of you will say, yeah, you're doing this wrong. You shouldn't do this anyway. This should be a module. And you're right. Having it as a module will definitely solve some of the issues that we have. So let's just see how this may look like. So again, we're having our example, but now the get theme is abstracted in its own module. I couldn't be bothered to make it an actual module, so I created a function. So my get theme function returns an object with the color and with the color property, and then inside you have primary property. Now, if you look at the app no longer needs to know about the theme in our particular case. So there's nothing in it. If you look at the main component, there's nothing in it as well. It just needs to call the top nav. And now the top nav is the one that actually does care about the theme. And I'll explain in a minute why. So the top nav gets the theme, invokes our custom button components, and passes the color to it. And the button component is, like in the other examples, grabs the color from the props and says the arbitrary class name. Now, some of you will say here probably, yeah, you could have just directly called the get theme inside the button and be done with it. True, I could have done that, but remember the overall goal here and what actually makes reusable components with the highest reusability is that we need to keep them dumb, meaning that they shouldn't care about which environment and which context are they being used. So if I just use the get theme inside the button, that means that that button is locked with that theme. I cannot really reuse it somewhere else if I wanted to, maybe in a different application. So we're keeping the button dumb. The parent component gets whatever it's needed and provides it. So don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with passing properties around. In fact, the default way of how React is supposed to work and is working is by passing properties around. But in our example, that may not be the best case out there. And also remember that if you add some other requirements into the mix, like let's say we want to have a dark theme and a light theme, or switch them up dynamically somehow, that may not be the best solution. So let's spice it up a bit. Let's look at a little bit more complex example of a component. So let's take a tabs component, for instance, right? Everybody has used tabs. Every web app needs tabs components. In our example here, you can see it's a simple one. You have buttons on the top, and then the content basically loads based on whatever button is being selected, based on whatever tabs is being selected. But what we want here is to also add a twist. And what we want is to allow for developers to be able to compose their own tabs component using our own, meaning that we want to provide, we want our tabs to manage the state, tabs component to manage the state, and maybe expose some public API, and then allow developers to freely compose their own DOM structure, HTML structure to actually put, to make the tabs fit their use case, meaning that for instance, we would like to provide them with the ability to make the top bar of the tab component, I don't know, somewhere else on the page, maybe on the left, on the right, as a sticky somewhere, stuff like that, allowing them to put things in between. Cool. Challenge accepted. Bring it on. Let's see how we can do that. Now, it's time to actually look at React context. So a little bit an overview. If you go to the official React documentation and check what actually React context is, it reads this specific line, which says that context provides a way to pass data through component tree without having to pass props down manually at every level. Now, if you think about it, this sounds superb. This is exactly the thing which we need to actually achieve our use case. It sounds like something that all our dreams will come true and our components will be perfect, etc. But let's actually see what this means in the context of our tabs component before we continue. So basically what we want, if you look on the left side here, On the left side, we have a typical structure of a tabs component. You have your tabs wrapper, and then inside you have a section for tabs header and tabs content. So what we want is for people to swap the components that we're providing out of the box with their own components, my custom tabs header and my custom tabs component. Why? Well, first things first, because probably they already have some sort of components that would like to reuse. They want to style them again. But also because their components can probably fit their use case more correctly than what we provide out of the box. All right, now that we have that out of the way, at this point, some of you will probably say, talk is cheap, show me the code. Yeah, it is about time to actually look at some code. But before that, let's nail our requirements down so that just we know what we want to achieve at the end. So let's list them. So we want our tabs component to have to behave like any normal tabs component out of the box. Simple. We want some easy out of the box adoption, basically copy paste it and it works. We want some extendability out of the box, meaning that we want our out of the box solution to also have some props for easy modification. We'll see how we can do that. And the important part is we want to be able to compose our own tabs component via using custom components that we may already have, but don't care about how the state is being managed. So that still needs to be done by the tabs component that we're using. Now, keep in mind that a solution like this will take a lot of work, probably thousands of hours, to actually achieve the high standards we at Material UI expect for it to be truly reusable and production ready and used by a lot of people. And also keep in mind that if you add stuff like I18N or accessibility into the mix, things will start to get really complicated really fast and really hairy. So having that nailed down, let's actually scope it down even more because we're time limited and see what we're actually gonna do in this talk. So what we're gonna have the ability to change tabs. That's the default one. We'll have the ability to predefine which tab is being active. I basically set a default active tab. And the last one, of course, is the ability to compose your own tabs component. Cool. So enough talk, code time. Now, if I switch here, you should be able to see my screen. So let's first see what demos we have, so that we know when we're looking to the code what we're actually looking at. So as you see here, I've prepared two examples, a very basic. The first one, we have a default demo, which uses the tabs component that we wrote out of the box. It works, it switches tabs, tabs to is tab 2, simple. And the other one is the context demo. Now granted, they look fairly the same with one exception, that the second one only has 2 tabs. But I just wanted to illustrate that even though we're using kind of a different approach to write that tabs component, it still behaves the same. So here you can see it also switches tabs. Cool. So let's actually look into the code. What I have here is I have a running server again, but let's see what the code actually looks like. So if you look at our app.js, which is like the entry point of our application, just a side note though, I used React Create App to bootstrap this demo, so I'm not going to bother explaining how it works. This is not really the focus. So if you use this React Create App under the hood. So the structure of the project is very simple. Our entry point is the app.js, a JSX file, the main component. And then in the components folder, I have a single component, a nested component called stabs. In it, I have all the components that I need, and I export everything through out of the index JavaScript file. So nothing really fancy about the structure. So let's look at the demos first. So the entry point. So as you saw, I have the 2 demos. The default one is here, and the context is down here. So let's first look at the default one. So as you can see, it's super simple. I've imported my out-of-the-box tabs component, and I'm using it. It accepts one prop, which is default tab 1. So I have the ability to set what the default tab is when that component renders. And then underneath, you see I have basically 3 divs, which represent each one of the tabs. And the way that I'm using to distinguish which tab is which is by having a label. True, that probably is not the best solution, but hey, I did it anyway. So a label, of course, the first one has label 1, 2, 3, etc. And underneath is the content. Cool. So this is out of the box. It works. Now, the more important one and the meat of the talk actually is this one. So as you can see here, it's kind of the same structure, but not really. So what we have here is something called tabs provider. Again, we're importing this from the tabs component. And underneath, we have basically whatever HTML structure we want. So we've created this one. I've created this one just to illustrate that it's no longer tied to what we expect on the previous example. So here we have a tabs header, which is a component that is exported from the tabs just to make things a little bit easier. But you can treat it as my custom tabs header. So I have 2 of them. They both accept a single prop, which is value. So does the provider, but we'll get in that into a minute. So I have 2 of them, and then underneath I have a component called tabs content, which basically is tied to a particular tabs header by also setting a value to the tabs component, which accepts a value, and of course it has 1 or 2. It's just a way to kind of know which tab content belongs to which tab header. Cool, simple, nothing really interesting. So let's look at what the tabs provider is, because this is essentially the entry point of our component. This is the place where we manage the functionality. The tabs context, excuse me. So if you open the file, you'll notice a couple of things. First things first, and I probably forgot to mention that, but now is a good time. So just to give you some version overview, the context API is available since React 16.3, give or take. There's another API for context, but for the sake of this talk, we're not going to focus on that. And also, we're going to be using hooks extensively. So please, we're only going to focus on functional React components. If you're using class components, we need to, you need to go and Google that. But again, it's 2021. Please use functional components. Cool. So let's look at what's happening here. So at the very beginning of the file, we're creating 2 contexts using React create context. And why are there 2? Well, first things first. So I'm creating the contexts, initializing them with value of null. And the first one is going to hold our state. And the second one is called tabs dispatch context, but this one is actually going to hold our public API. Why there are 2 again? Some people prefer to bundle their state and the API into a single context. I don't. There's a valid reason for this. I'll explain it a little bit later. Or maybe I should explain it now, actually, because maybe later I won't have time and I may forget to mention, but it's kind of important. So how context works is whenever you kind of use the context somewhere, doesn't matter what it is, and you have some React components nested underneath it, every time the context change, React will know to notify all the components underneath to actually re-render automatically. So let's say if you have both your API and state into a single context, if part of your application only cares about the state and another part of your application only cares about the context, every time you modify the state, both parts of your application will re-render because essentially they're the same context. But if you keep them separate, that means that part of the application where only needs to update the context of the state doesn't need to re-render because essentially the API context doesn't change. So that way you make your app more performant and decrease the amount of re-renders that happen in your application. So that's why 2 are probably better than 1. So let's get back into the code. Here I'm initializing them. We'll get into that tabs reducer in a second. Underneath I have 2 React hooks. Basically they're sugar on top of what you can already do. And what they do is just kind of pre-select the context and export it. So use tab state uses the context of the state, and use tab dispatch uses the context of the dispatch, aka API. And now the important thing is, here's our tabs provider component. If you look carefully at what it does, it basically grabs the value from the props. We need that. Then it creates a React reducer. A side note, React user reducer is similar to what React used state is, but there are some differences. So we're again providing it with value of the state. But then also we kind of be able to provide a callback function to handle actually the events. So here we're grabbing the state and the dispatch function. And in the return function, look at now what we have. So we are invoking the provider for the state context, passing it a value of the state, and the value of the state has an active tab of which equals to value, and value is the property that comes from the parent, from our app where we invoke it, which is basically here. So we're setting that as the default one. Then we're also adding underneath the provider for the dispatch context, again, passing the value of the dispatch and rendering whatever is inside our tabs provider component, like the children. And that's pretty much it. Again, this can be achieved out of the box. And this is, again, kind of just sugar on top of what you can already do. But it just makes it as a nicer public API for people to use. And let's just quickly look at what reducer is. It's nothing special. It's just like any other Redux reducer. It's just a switch statement. We're caring only about one type of event, which is change tab. So when that happens, we set the state of the active tabs becomes either the payload or the current active tab. Basically, yeah, if the tab doesn't change, the state doesn't change. Well, actually it does, but yeah, well, you get the point. Cool. So having that cleared out, let's look at what the default out-of-the-box tabs component actually looks like. So if you look at the tabs component, it's actually very simple and very short. The only thing that happens here is we're invoking again our tabs provider, and we're passing we're setting the value of it to be whatever is the value of the default prop that we used when we initialized it, which is here. So default tab 1, we're passing that and setting the value of the provider to be that. Now, what I'm trying to say here is that although we have kind of two different ways of how to use that tabs component, we don't have two different implementations. We only have one implementation, which is the most complex one, which is like how to make it extendable and composable. And then we're basically using that as a base to create an out-of-the-box solution for those developers who just want to copy paste and work, and that's it. They don't want to modify. Cool. So having cleared that out, I also have some error checking. I'm grabbing here the state using my custom created hook, use tab state, and basically checking if this exists. And yeah, somebody is using the provider and underneath tabs, some error handling. That's it. So let's look at what the actual main functionality of the component, where it lives, and that's inside this tab stateless component. Granted, that may be not the best name, but hey, I named it that way. I'm sticking to it. So let's see what this component actually does. So first things first, I also need to grab the state again. So I'm getting that. And if you look at the render function, I have some DOM structure here. And then inside it, I have a method to render, a function to render the headers and one to render the content. So if you look at the one that we render the headers with, it's very simple. Grab the children. These are the separate divs, the default ones, map through them, get the label prop, and then return a custom tabs header component, which accepts a property of value, which is basically the label. Key is needed here because of React. And then we just pass the label underneath. So basically, we just render the name of the tab. Cool. And if you look at the other one, the content, that's fairly simple as well. What it does is just looks for the children, checks if the label of that child matches the current active tab in the state, If it does, it returns it. That's it. We're not bothering with hide, show, or whatever. Render all of them. We're just rendering the one that is currently being active. That's it. Last but not least, let's look at what the tabs header is, because that's where we're actually going to use our public API and emit some stuff. So the header grabs the state. It grabs the API, aka the dispatch. I have some error handling. And then in the render, we return a single div with a non-click handler, passing a non-click method. Yeah. And the only thing that this does is it uses our dispatch from the public API by dispatching an event from that is of type change tab. And we're passing the payload, which is basically the value. And the value we got from the parent, that's the value of the tab. Cool. And before we actually finish, let's look at what the tab content is. Again, very simple. We're grabbing the state, have some checks here. And basically, if the value of the tab's content matches the current active tab in the state, well, if it doesn't match it, we don't return anything. If it does match it, then we just return like a div that renders all the children inside. Basically, just return that tab content that represents the current active tab. Cool. And this looks like this. We already checked the demo, but yeah, it works. It's nice. Cool. So having cleared that out, let me just see if I missed something somewhere. Probably not. Again, you have access to the code later on. But let's just get back to the presentation because we're kind of running out of time a bit. So recap. There's one main important thing here that I wanted to focus really on, and that's about having, if necessary, and if you're going to provide the ability for people to have both state and API, to have separate contexts. It really depends on your use case. I would, if I have to choose by myself, I'll definitely go for separate, just because I don't want React to re-render, like go berserk and re-render different parts of my application without me actually wanting for them to re-render. And I bet that developers that are using your components would definitely want to have that option, even though it may take them a couple of more steps to actually copy-paste the code and use maybe one or two additional components that you provide. But that's an important one. Decrease the amounts of re-renders. Cool. So we have kind of 2 minutes, so it's closing words time. First things first, if you're more interested in how this thing works and want to check some more complex examples, you can always check the tabs component that we have in Material UI. I've given the link to the docs and a demo. That's also part of the docs, of course. That one uses extensively that approach under the hood with the context and this exact situation where we export the context and then wrap it for a nicer out-of-the-box experience. So you can check that. But if that's not enough for you, again, you can even go one step further. We also have a component that's called data grid. That one also uses context extensively under the hood. And that one also has an enterprise version called xgrid that also exports an API context so that people can actually use it and provide like a comprehensive public API for people to use, for developers to use. You can check that again in our docs, and yeah, there's some example of how this is done. Another example of libraries that may use context under the hood, that'll be React Redux uses it. React Router uses it to give you access to the router properties in your component. So yeah, quite a lot of libraries that does use that. And that's my Apple One More Thing event. So in closing, what I wanted to say is that there's a time and a place where you should use context, and that you shouldn't go for the context solution every time you need to share some state between components. Depending on your use case, a more appropriate solution may be needed, aka like React Redux, if you need the ability to actually plug middleware in between. So yeah. Here are the resources of the presentation. You can check the slides here. You can check the code in my GitHub repository. It's open source, play with it, download it, whatever. Thank you again for having me. You can follow me on Twitter, follow me on GitHub. And again, if you've ever used Material UI or you're interested, we're always welcome feedback. So yeah, go check us out. Thank you again for having me. Have a nice day. Bye.